Oh.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I don't know. You've just made this cup of coffee undrinkable. Kind of looks like... Oh, we don't say that word on campus. Sorry. All right. Well, let's get back together and talk more a little bit about the context of the first 11 chapters of the Old Testament. So, historically, the context that we want to be aware of and what Moses was aware of, we don't know exactly for sure where and how Moses got his information other than divine revelation. But knowing a little bit about the author, we've said this before, Moses, the well-educated author, would have probably been, growing up in the best schools in the courts of Pharaoh and the Harvard of his day, perhaps. I'm just speculating, perhaps, but he would have had access to historical archives, would have known a little bit about history and some of these developments. So bringing it all in and making it kind of like you might say, the authorized history for God's people, Israel. But really the center of gravity for all of this history is the Mesopotamia river valley, Tigris and Euphrates, right there in modern-day Iraq, of all things. This is where the primary activities of the first 11 chapters of the Old Testament take place. This was Abraham's Egypt. Abraham is going to leave this place to go to the Promised Land, for example. That's one way to think about it. When he got his call from the Lord. Mesopotamia is also going to be the location of the Ark building. It's also going to be the location of the building of the Tower of Babel when we get to the end of chapter 11. It's the probable location, I would argue, of the Garden of Eden, the location of where God deposits the first image of God bearing fully created living critters, namely Adam and Eve. So this is where it all starts, not in the Promised Land, in Mesopotamia. So that's what I want to say there. But interestingly, we know a lot about the broad history of Mesopotamia. So again, I'm not getting into any debates here with regards to how old things are, the age of the earth. We'll talk about that later. But we go back to early periods, back to Stone Age technology, way back. But really what I'm interested in is the formative period here that we have. Mesopotamia is part of that Fertile Crescent. You know that, by the way, I have to give a disclaimer. I wrote some pretty awkwardly written quiz questions on week 3 quiz, number 1 and number 5. So I'm giving everybody full credit on both of those questions if you missed it, just because I'm a knucklehead. Oh, sorry. I'll admit that sometimes. And I wrote a poor question on the quiz. So enough of you barked and complained. I don't want anybody to think that they can make a habit of it, right, throughout the whole semester. Because I'll start, anyway, I'll try to write really, really, really good quiz questions from this point on. Yes, sir?
Are you referring to the Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrians?
No, not that question. That was a perfectly written question. Don't start talking to me about quiz questions, because I'm going to get... Okay, well, knucklehead's an appropriate term. Oh, here we go. Discussion begins.
If you got it wrong, please allow 24 hours for...
Yeah, he's going to fix it.
To change. So
he's going to fix it.
Emailing tonight
yeah.
It hasn't been reflected yet. So
all right, so I heard a breath of relief and sigh of relief coming through the camera with that announcement. So, yes. All right, so the formative period. Here's what we have, and where's I going with that? That Mesopotamia, that reminded me of the Fertile Crescent question that confused a lot of people. So I changed that question. So the Fertile Crescent question. If you haven't taken the quiz on week 3, you can still take it, but the situation, you're on your own. So it's just the way it is. I made the question easier, but everybody should get it right. 10,000 to 3,000 BC. What we see, though, in the evidence archaeology and what we're finding in the sand over there is evidence of a developing civilization. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later and kind of try to understand that in terms of what the Bible talks to us about history. But it's interesting to know, leading up to and right up to before the time of Abraham, where we basically broadly say he got his start or he got his call in 2000 BC. Moses is in around 1500 BC. So that time period, what we see in this dynastic period in Mesopotamia, you see it on the chart, this spike in civilization. Ancient writing, Mesopotamia was the center for cuneiform tablets from all these different cities. The city of Ur was established as a dominant city-state as early as 2700 BC. So that's 700 years before Abraham walked those streets. That's where he grew up, Abraham, in Ur. Around 2000 BC, we see a renaissance that involved art, literature, and ancient law. So when we learn about these civilized cultures, we can dig into the ground, see these hardened clay tablets, read the cuneiform, and understand how they were governing themselves as a civilization. They weren't just beating each other up with a hard mallet, They were civilized. They had laws that protected and governed society. And they had kings and legal people that oversee the laws and establish and define culture. Writing contracts. So by the time of Moses, the high development in writing, treaty documents. Treaty documents we learn a lot about. We made that part of our argument, right? Last time when we talked about the structure, the covenant structure of the Pentateuch and evidences of treaties that we have or covenants that we have in the biblical text, what period do they look more like? We'd say second millennial would be examples from this, or first millennial. We said second millennial. That's where they go, and that lines up better with Moses being aware of and being sensitive to this time in history. All right, so going back to, again, just as a way of rehashing, Moses on the plains of Moab. There you see it on the screen, and the direction arrow shows them when they cross the Jordan River and fight their first battle at Jericho. So this is again, just to emphasize the vantage point in which we have Moses, the author, here as a prophet, hearing from the Lord. He's looking back at ancient history now and giving Israel Genesis 1 through 11. What did Israel need to know? Why was that important? Israel as a people needed to know how they were connected to, you might say, the history and the development of humanity. They needed to know some things about who they were, why they're valuable in the eyes of God. These are all defined for them in Genesis 1 through 11, as we'll see. What they were supposed to do, what's the basic job description of humanity, comes out of Genesis 1 through 11. So these are important things. And they had important implications for Israel. So I'm going to call these, as we look through Genesis 1 through 11, I'm not going to cover every jot and tittle, but what I'm going to try to do is unpack lessons, theological lessons that I think just scream off the page and would have been important for an author/theologian like Moses to emphasize for his audience, Israel. Does that make sense? That's what we're talking about. Maybe you've never read the first 11 chapters of Genesis through this lens or from this approach. Maybe it's never dawned on you that I'm really dealing with Moses. He's really talking to an audience. And I hope what you see is that these theological trajectories, these theological themes are foundational to a nation that's been recently defined, newly, has come on the scene and needs to understand the foundation for everything else that Moses has taught. So that's going to be important. All right, so we're ready for lesson 1. Let's turn in our Bibles to Genesis 1. That's just where the first lesson comes from. And because it's in the very first chapter of the Bible, we might consider it a very important theological lesson, a foundational theological lesson for Israel. And that's my thesis. I think we're dealing with an intentional author who knew very well what he was doing. And he's very intentional in why he was doing what he was doing. Yeah?
A quick question about the Mosaic authorship. So, at least I know it's believed that Moses may have received all 5 books of the Pentateuch on Mount Sinai. Is that your belief?
That's a theory.
Just theory.
Yeah.
So
he's writing all along.
Okay.
Out of Egypt, he's an active author throughout the entire event of Israel out of Egypt to the plains of Moab. So he's an active, and why I say that is because he's an active instructor. The whole heart behind the Torah is instruction. Hopefully you saw that. That's what the word means. Not law, it's instruction. And everything in the Torah is intentional for the purpose of preparation for what next. Where are they going? It's the promised land. Everything they need to know, Moses has given it to them in the Torah. So we'll see that. And you start to see some of this theological evaluation from the author, from Moses, looking back. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, it's a great example of what I'm talking about because he evaluates theologically the previous event that just took place and ended. It's the wilderness wandering. He gives his theological evaluation right there to his audience. They're asking, the generation that came out of the wilderness are asking the question, why did we have to go through this? Well, he gives the answer. So I think that's what we have. Oh, here we go.
What about my students? William wants to know if Moses received help in writing.
Yes, there's some. We looked at that in the lecture that I gave, where we were talking about the formation of the Pentateuch and the argument for Moses's. I think I referenced a couple places in my notes there with a reference to scribal, use of scribes, perhaps. So in terms of Moses, he's writing, but he's also probably has a team of people who we can picture that easily help him write as well. Good question. All right, so these are the theological lessons of Moses. Now let's take a look at Genesis 1. We'll talk about the doctrine of creation in a little more depth maybe next week. But I just want to cover kind of a brief overview of Genesis 1. I'm sure it's familiar turf for a lot of you, the creation account in Genesis 1. But here's what we have going on, and I just want to show you how to, my approach to trying to get at the theological high point of the text. Surely we have the emphasis on the creation activity, and we've got this series, the sequence of days that continue from creation day 1, the light in the heavens, and then creation day 2, verses 6 through 8, the firmament, the sky and the seas. Sky and seas are created, and finally, day 3, we have the dry land and vegetation that's created. One way to think about that is in terms of what God did in creations 1 through 3, in creation day 1 through 3, is created the domains, and I'll say it this way, the domains for the created purpose to be expressed. How's that? The domain in which the created purpose of some living thing will be expressed. So how's that parallel out? So you've got some nice symmetry going on in Genesis 1. So then, parallel to creation day 1, so what living things are going to be created and put in the domain of the lights or the heavens up there? Well, it's the sun and the moon. And they're going to have function because they're going to rise and we know rotate around. They're going to have motion. Day, evening and morning and all of that will be defined by the rising and setting of the sun and moon. Creation day 5 parallels creation day 2 in terms of what living things, living critters get put in the sky and the seas. Well, Moses gives us the answer. Birds and fish. And in fact, we start to see that functionality is beginning to be defined. So the idea of function now becomes, apparent. So what are living things, living critters, namely fish and birds, are supposed to do? Moses tells us, fill and multiply. That's what they do, living things. That's part of their created job description. So we're getting into some of the theology of creation, but there's still a high point we haven't gotten to yet. Creation day 6, we have land animals and, some say, the pinnacle of creation. I'm not disagreeing with that. That is human beings, human critters, human living things. And we're giving a job description as well. Now, let's see, what do I have next? All of these commands seem to work well for most animals, except for maybe this one exception. That was the lead into the video.
Yeah.
This is a coffee break for me.
Male. Cat. Domestic short hair. Is available for adoption instead of the week. Western County Animal Shelter. Very loving cat.
Don't put a cat on a leash. Lesson number 1. It doesn't work. No, this is... I don't know. And the video is still going, right? All right. I don't know if it's... Sorry if it's wrong to laugh at other people's expense and pain. That's what we do. So lesson 1. Let's talk about lesson 1. And if we keep reading in the creation account in Genesis 1, now you have to recognize that in the original Bible, there were no chapter and verse divisions. You just kept on reading. Sometimes we have to train ourselves not to put this big break after chapter 1 to chapter 2. But if we keep reading in chapter 2, verse 1, after the declaration, everything that was created is declared as good, the heavens, and then we have Moses giving us kind of a recap in verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. And by the 7th day, God completed his work which he had done. He rested on the 7th day from all of his work which he had done. Verse 3, then God blessed the 7th day. He sanctified it, because in it he rested from all of his work which God had created and made. And then verse 4, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made heaven and earth. Now, it's kind of maybe hidden there a little bit, but let me try to amplify it to a degree here. So I'm thinking of Moses, the author, and he's addressing an ancient audience. Now, to the ancient audience, what you just read would have really rung a loud bell or a loud gong, because what you've just seen or heard in the case of Moses, and you would have understood very clearly what was very common in the ancient world, much more common than it is now, especially in our country. We don't really have a context for this. But what you've just heard being described is significant. Because in the ancient world, there's only one kind of person who can sit. And when he sits, he commands and demands everything else around him to do the same. Who is that person? What kind of person is this? A king. So what's interesting for Moses, he's done 2 things here. He's done 2 things. Chapter 2, verse 4. He has introduced Israel to the king who sits. And he's sitting on a throne, which means he rules. He's now king over everything that he has just done and accomplished. So by resting, it's kind of putting the bold period at the end of this statement. Only a king does that. So not only that, Moses does one more thing in verse 4. He gives us very specific information about who this king is for Israel. You remember in Israel's history, a pretty significant defining moment for them happened at a place called Mount Sinai. Y'all saw the movie. Prince of Egypt, what's the Out of Egypt. No, the movie about the cartoon. Prince of Egypt, yeah. I was thinking of Out of Egypt. No, that's a movie about lions or something else. I don't know. But anyway, Prince of Egypt, the significant defining moment. Mount Sinai, what happens there? Who does Israel get introduced to? Who'd they meet for the first time? God. By what name? Yahweh. Yeah, the significant name that God says, oh, my name is Yahweh. Guess what Moses does here? This is the first place that we see and read the name capital L-O-R-D, which is the English translation of the Hebrew word name for God, Yahweh. The significant covenant name for God is introduced to Israel at Mount Sinai. Yahweh is his covenant name. So this is a significant theological high point for Israel. Moses just gets done introducing God, not just as any old God. He's the one that we met at Mount Sinai. That's the God who created everything that I've just gotten done unpacking for you in chapter 1. Although Moses wouldn't have said chapter 1 because chapter divisions weren't there yet. But in the early part of my book, those days of creation, God is Yahweh. They would have stood up and cheered. See? That's significant. And he's king. See, forever. And from this point on, remember we saw this with our theological bookends idea. The idea of Yahweh, now I can advance the slide, Yahweh as king, and he's also creator. So this is significant. And guess what theological theme? This idea of God as king, this is a theological theme that extends all the way through, theologically, Israel's history. All the way through the entire history, all the way up through the prophets. And that verse that we talked about earlier, the day of the Lord idea, the day that's still yet to come, the prophets say, on that day, finally, the nations will stream up and acknowledge the Lord, Yahweh, as king. He will sit on his throne one more time. Again, Zechariah, we can turn there to chapter 14. Remember the bookends that we looked at on the very first day. All the prophet looking ahead to the day of the Lord was the day when God will be celebrated. The Lord will be celebrated as king one more time. That's huge. So that's the foundational lesson that everybody else pulls from, but comes from the Martin Luther of his day, Moses. He's making the theology come alive for his audience, and that's Israel. Now, and a pretty significant launching point from that idea, Yahweh, the Lord, the covenant giver, is king and creator, is this idea. Who are we? This is an important lesson for Israel. It's an important lesson for us. We are little kings. So this all comes into the idea. Let's turn to it. We didn't read it, but in let's see. Let's have Garnett. Could you read for me in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28? You have that? All right.
Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his image, in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them.
Okay. Yeah, keep going. One more verse.
God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.
Okay, so here's an idea that I want to kind of unpack a little bit. I might do a little board work here, but it's the idea of the image of God, and I'm going to equate this idea with the image of God. The image of God is the image by which and for whom we're created in, right? And it's another way of saying it is this is the idea of bearing the name. That's the key idea of. In our case, or in Moses' case, Yahweh, the name that he's just introduced. So what does it mean to be created in the image of God? It's the idea of that my job is to bear and carry with me the name of Yahweh wherever I go, independently or individually or corporately as a nation. And this idea of name, I think I talked about it a little bit before last time. You can also bring with it, I can't write on the board because I'm going to be knocked off there. But this idea of name can also mean this idea of reputation. Reputation. You know, with smartphones and spell checker on our computers, we're becoming a generation of people who can't spell. Isn't that something? I struggle with that. So that's my knuckleheadedness coming through. Just giving you advance warning. Reputation. So it's bearing the name of Yahweh. So individually and then corporately, Israel's to bear that name, that reputation, where they're going to go, which is the Promised Land. That's foundational for their existence. that's defining who they are as a nation, their unique status as the people of God. So that's going to be foundational for them. And, he gives humanity in Adam, the first image of God bearer, on the planet, the basic job description, right? He's saying, well, you're going to be a little bit like the animals, fill and multiply. You're going to do exactly the same thing. You're going to have babies, and you're going to walk around and roam around and expand, but you're also going to rule and subdue. Those are the extra things that he gives. And, this might be a little bit of an extension of, the idea of we're little kings, so we do what the king does. And part of our expansion job, our expansion project, the divine agenda, is to rule and subdue, thus expand and extend the name or the reputation of this Creator God into the whole world. So that's foundational to Israel. Israel is supposed to be invited to see their role. This is if you haven't had a missions course, this is obviously foundational for any of our missionary efforts. Why do we want to go out into the world? We're merely expressing the foundational human, the image of God bearing responsibility that we have as human beings. Now newly recreated in Christ, but still it attaches, all that New Testament language attaches to this foundational point. Now, here's some other implications of the idea of the image of God. The fact that human beings are uniquely created, different than the animals, in the image of God. Here's what we can say. Fill, multiply, rule, and subdue, but what else? What are some other kinds of things? What are some other implications of, Adam is like God in the fact that he's created in the image of God, but he is not God. We can't make that mistake. Shirley MacLaine, New Age philosophy is all wrong on that point. There's a defined boundary line between humanity as image of God bearers, but we're not essence of God bearers. There's a difference. You'll have to take your philosophy course to sort all of that out. But there are certain implications, practical implications of bearing or carrying the name of God, also seen in humanity's unique ability to be creative, like the picture here, invent, design, solve problems, and communicate in unique ways. That's unique to humanity. Also, we have in us, uniquely different than other created living things, the ability and the desire to know things about and worship God. So that foundation for worship is built into our hard wiring. Whether we're rebelling against that or falling in obedient line to that, it's still hardwired in the fact that we want to worship. We have this desire to do that. Also, the ability to remain objective is a human quality, to think outside of the box, given our present situation. That's kind of unique. And also, the reality, this is number 4, the reality of the value of every human being who bears the name of Yahweh is woven into and hardwired into the image of God bearing. Everybody on the planet that's a human being falls under this category of bearing the image of God. So you're going to see, you probably already anticipate some of the things that matter for this. Now let me just show you where this goes really quick. We'll have a little mini bookend here. The bookends I come to because they're ways of connecting things in Scripture. So here's a mini bookend. So Genesis 1, first part of the bookend, Genesis 11, and the Tower of Babel episode. There's some language here that we have to appreciate. In verse 4, Moses describes the rebellion of what took place at the Tower of Babel as it relates to the image of God bearing or the name bearing responsibility of humanity. I don't know if you've ever seen this before. Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And come, let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. You hear the snooty, rebellious tone. Let us build for ourselves. Let's make for ourselves a name. We don't want to bear and carry around the name and reputation of Yahweh or the Lord or God. We want to we'll talk to the hand because the face ain't listening. This is rebellion 101, right? We'll build for ourselves a name and our own reputation, not bear and carry the name of the Lord. So what are the implications of this rebellion in our current culture and society, in our current climate? How are we doing now at name building? How are we doing? Well, how are we doing with our rebellion, our principle for building our own name and our own reputation? One of the things that happens is we redefine what it means to be human. How's that? We redefine what it means to be human. We have all kinds of definitions now of what it means to be human. How's that for one cultural whack? Is that hitting home with anybody? You've got relatives, family members. I know it's hard. But we've got culture wanting to redefine what it truly means to be human. So that's that's one of the things that we see. We redefine also what it means to be human. What did I do there? Oh, number 2. We devalue, not only redefine, but we devalue what it means to be human. So we've been around this one for a while, the whole abortion debate. The value of the human being gets redefined. We also encounter conflict over what it means to be human. The conflict, I'm just showing one example, historically in the context of our own country, but it's the whole racial prejudice thing that's woven into the fabric of this country and is continuing to overflow. This gets back to the value of the human being, the equality of all human beings, regardless of country of origin, color of skin. It equates equal value to all. How's that? I could say it a lot of different ways. So those are some of the impacts of the confusion created by this basic foundational rebellion that we see in the very first chapters of Genesis. Science, though, modern science, has a part to play in all of this. Modern science is also trying to redefine what it means to be human. This is something I made up when I was on a creative role. I just made up this sentence because I was trying to pretend to be a scientist, kind of an arrogant modern scientist, hear me roar kind of scientist. We are here by chance on a planet third rock from the sun with no universal significance or importance except for that which we define for ourselves. So through science and education, we expect to build a civilization that can reach the stars and discovery. We can discover where we came from and perhaps even the very essence of why we are here. So press on. And through scientific innovation, we can defeat death, define meaning and purpose for everyone, which includes now and more than ever sexual roles and preferences, lifestyles and function. And in the end, we can save the world. Isn't that captured a little bit? I tried to be dramatic. How many of you know that on the side I'm part of a acting troupe in a community theater? Every now and then I'll play a role in a play. I'll let you know about the spring production of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. If you're in my spring class, you can go and attend and get extra credit. I'm not winning the role of Charlie or Willy Wonka. Maybe I'll be Grandpa or something like that. But I have a pretty good role of doing this. So this is so what does this look like with modern science? So this is what it looks like. The modern scientific advance here has a way of taking over, you might say, the divine role of God and the dependent relationship that we have as human beings on God as King and Creator. So it kind of drives a wedge in that relationship. Science is trying to take over that kind of relationship that we have. So here's what it looks like. When we're sick, what do? We take a pill, right? When we're hungry, what do? Drive to the grocery store and grab a hamburger on the way home. When we're in sin, what do? We see a psychologist. When we're in peril or danger, what do? We call our insurance company, right? Things like that. It's not a dependence. We're dependent on ourselves and our seemingly scientific advances. Science in the modern science that we're talking about really is, in a way, taking over that role of what we're supposed to do: fill, multiply, rule, and subdue. So it kind of interferes with that. I've got some interesting video clips that I want to show. This one here. Now we're getting into Darwinian evolution, which is, of course, one of those modern expressions of science, and part of the ways that one particular slice of science has come in and tried to redefine things that we already know and what we've already seen from the earliest chapters in Genesis. You know, Darwinian evolution is going to remind us that humanity is not unique. We're not special. Planet Earth is nothing special. We're, ask us and we'll tell you, we're sure that life exists everywhere in the universe. And if it does, it's just evolving there, like it is here. So let's hear what that looks like in this video clip. This is Richard Dawkins, the militant atheist that we have his books on our book, not my bookcase, but anyway, some of them.
You have written that God is a psychotic delinquent invented by mad, deluded people.
No, I didn't say quite that. I said something rather better than that.
Oh, well, please say that. Please say that.
Well, I would have to read it from the book.
No, please.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser. A misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
So that's what you think of God?
Yeah.
How about people believe in a God of infinite lovingness and kindness and forgiveness and generosity, sort of like the modern day God? Why spoil it for them? Why not just let them have their fun and enjoy it?
I mean, I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. I write a book, people can read it if they want to. I believe that it is a liberating thing to free yourself from primitive superstition.
So religion's a primitive superstition?
I think it is, yes.
So you believe it's liberating to tell people that there is no God?
I think a lot of people, when they give up God, feel a great sense of release and freedom.
Why do you think that? I mean, what's your dad? What's your scientist? What's your dad?
I think, well, I've had a lot of letters saying that.
There are 8 billion people in the world, Dr. Dawkins. How many letters have you had?
I haven't done that quite true.
Professor Dawkins seemed so convinced that God doesn't exist that I wondered if he would be willing to put a number on it.
Well, it's hard to put a figure on it, but I mean, I put it as something like, 99% against or something.
Well, I know it's 99%. You're saying not 97.
No, you asked me to put a figure on it, and I'm not comfortable putting a figure on it. I just think it's very unlikely.
What? But you couldn't put a number on it.
No, of course not.
So it would be 49%.
Well, it would be. I mean, I think it's unlikely, but it's quite far from 50%.
How do you know?
I don't know. I mean, I put an argument in the book.
Well, then who did create the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
What was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, how did that happen?
I've told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto, perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry and molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe. But that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So, Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God. So the Hebrew God, the God of the Old Testament, he doesn't exist in your view?
Certainly, I mean, that would be a very unpleasant prospect.
And the Holy Trinity of the New Testament?
Nothing like that.
Do you believe in any of the Hindu gods? Like Krishna?
How could you ask such a question?
You don't,
How
right?
could I? What would I, given that I don't believe in any others?
You don't believe in Muslim God?
No. Why do you even need to ask?
Well, I just wanted to be sure. So you don't believe in any God anywhere?
Any God anywhere would be completely incompatible with anything that I've said in
I just wanted to make sure you don't believe in any God anywhere.
No.
What if after you died you ran into God? What have you been doing, Richard? I mean, what have you been doing? When God would be nice to you, I gave you a multi-million-dollar paycheck over and over again with your book, and look what you did.
Bertrand Russell had that point put to him. He said something like, "Sir, why did you take such pains to hide yourself?"
But if the intelligent design people are right, God isn't hidden. We may even be able to encounter God through science, if we have the freedom to go there. What could be more intriguing than that?
All right. Well, I picked that one because it really does a good job of bringing you right to the kernel of how the Darwinian evolutionist thinks. And you had some interesting admissions there from Richard Dawkins. And before we take our next break, I just want to finish this critique, and then we'll take a break here before we finish out tonight. But you know the two driving forces behind Darwinian evolution are genetic. We're hearing a lot more about the genetic aspect. So the idea of genetic variability, genetic variables, or chance. That's the idea behind chance. Plus, and then the fancy word is survivalness, survivability, something like that. You've heard it, survival of the fittest, We'll abbreviate that. So those are the two forces that really is behind Darwinian evolution. This is the macroevolution part. We'll talk more about this when we get to the doctrine of creation a little bit later. But with regards to the broad critique of Darwinian evolution, you heard Dawkins in the video here. What about that first living self-replicating cell? Where'd that come from? The answer was we don't know. What about intelligent design, or the idea of design, the appreciation of everything that's just coming off the page when we study the first living cell? Darwin himself, scientists of Darwin's day, when they looked at a cell, they were looking at a blob. They didn't have the technology of the drilled down microscopes that were able to see at a subatomic particle level almost of the complexity. That video that I showed last time kind of hit on that a little bit with the complexity of how the cell repairs the walls of itself so that it doesn't die. And it was very complex. You saw what looked like a city organizing itself and things being delivered and picked up and all of that. That's part of what we're talking about. But, you know, his answer was, where's that intelligence come from? Other planets. Caught that, didn't you? Yeah, you know, it just so happens that from some other planet, Darwinian processes were at work, but for a longer period of time, and then the intelligence for life was, the word is seeded, S-E-E-D-E-D, like a planting a seed in the soil on this planet, but by some intelligent source, which Richard Dawkins went on to say, well, I'm not talking about God here. We're talking about an alien, the intelligent source. So that's interesting. Survival of the fittest, what's that done for us lately? That helps us understand. In other words, survival of the fittest, this is how it helps us to explain this. Certain aspects of humanity getting together and trying to control one of the other gene pools of humanity. For example, what happened in World War II with Nazi Germany and their attempt to exterminate the Jewish race, or the Jewish race gene pool. Survivability. So it's the whole premise behind the Nazi thinking behind the atrocities of World War II. So that's a good thing. What's that? That's, and this spirit is alive and well in our country in other ways as well. And another thing, there's what I showed you before with the whole LGBTQ thing. There's no survivability advantage to a same-sex couple because they don't have kids. But what's science doing with that these days? Well, we'll give their gene pool an advantage, and that's what's coming. Science can do that just as well. So you see this taking over, this subtle science. We can manipulate genes. We can control who's born and what they look like when they're born, and some of these things. That's just, that's the threat. That's where we're going with this when we start taking over the role that God has. I've got another short video here, and I probably want to skip that, but you can watch that at home. But I just want to go one more step with this. Where's all of this? When we start to erode the image of God, the foundational principle for all of humanity, when we introduce this high level of and sophisticated confusion about sexual roles and identities and what constitutes how the family's defined and some of these building blocks of culture and society and how people are supposed to understand themselves, what are the implications of this? We start to see things like this. And I just picked this one thing. It confuses people. And the solution is not returning back to, oh, by the way, you're a little bit confused about your purpose and meaning in life. Well, you've gone down this path, but here's the way back. No, it's not going and returning back to the foundation of, here's who you are as an image of God bearer, restored in Christ. That's not the solution, society says. It's education, right? We just have to educate the people who are making you feel bad about yourselves because of who you've defined yourself to be. And we just have to educate. That's the group therapy session of modern science. We just educate people into morality and acting correctly and properly. It doesn't get back to dealing with sin, dealing with the heart of the matter, restoring somebody in terms of who they are in God's image and rebuilt and renewed, the new creation in Christ. It's education. So that's how we solve the moral issues of society. All right, let's just go a little bit more and then we'll take a short break. So this is interesting because this was not a far cry from Israel's world. When Israel is now being prepared by Moses to go into that place, I'm pointing across the Jordan River to the Promised Land, guess what was already there? Paganism. Yeah, let's remind ourselves what Moses is warning. We'll jump ahead to the book of Leviticus, and he's given them an advanced scout on this. Moses in a lot of different places, but there's one place that kind of sums it up in Leviticus chapter 18. Let's turn there. Leviticus chapter 18. And Moses teaches, beginning in, I'll just start reading in verse 21. So these are parts of the warning. Neither shall you give any of your offspring to offer them to Molech. Molech is one of the pagan gods of the Promised Land, of the Canaanites, Molech. When you go to the first church of Molech, there's child sacrifice that happens in that church. That's what happens in the first church of Molech. You shall not profane, here's the idea, remember the name? You shall not profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh. Does that not echo, right, based on what we've talked about earlier? That's not expressing the name and the reputation of Yahweh when you're in the Promised Land. This is a violation of the very foundational truth. Yahweh, His name, what does it mean? Value of all humanity, and especially little children. Even we would say unborn children. Verse 22, you shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. Why? Because it violates the name of Yahweh and the image of God bearing responsibility of all humanity. That's not to be redefined, is to be established on how the Lord's defined it. You shall also not have intercourse with any animal to be defiled with it, nor any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion. Why? It's because it's a violation of the image of God bearing responsibility in all of humanity. That's the way to profane and misrepresent the name of Yahweh, because you're worshiping some pagan god who demands that of you. And that's not the way we're going to have church, Israel. That's what Moses is preaching here. I guess I can go on. No, that's it. That's all I want to say there. But you've got this pagan influence well entrenched in the Promised Land. I'm going to be pointing this direction for the Promised Land. So at its foundation, paganism, which I will argue is alive and well in our context, our modern context, it diverts attention, away from God as the one true God, to other little g gods or created things worthy of our worship. That's paganism. Or it also, as we were seeing, devalues the image of God in human beings. So it devalues that image of God and attempts, as we said, or tried to make the case, redefine it. So Moses is he's encouraging Moses is encouraging Israel to plant the flag of Yahweh, well entrenched right in the middle of pagan territory, well entrenched paganism. It was already there, alive and well, in the Promised Land, and guess what's going to have to take place? Here's the context for the book of Joshua. Battles are going to be fought, but they're going to be fought God's way. They're going to be fought in a humane way, but it's a spiritual battle that's going to be fought. Why? It's because paganism, I will argue, from the very beginning, we'll see when we look at Genesis 3, it was Satan's agenda from the beginning. Let me think here. I've already had my fall. And, here's God up to something here. Oh, image of God-bearing critters. I was okay with the animals, but now there's one that actually mirrors and reflects a little bit in aspects of who God is. In fact, the image of God-bearers on planet Earth, or I'm going to look at them and be reminded of God. I hate that. How am I going to destroy that? How am I going to redefine that? So it's been this subtle... This is what paganism is and does. It's this subtle, slow erosion that was around, I would argue, from the very beginning. So this is the challenge and this is the military picture here of Israel as a nation. This is what they're having to deal with as a new nation. This is why Moses is going to prepare them so well at how to define themselves as a nation. How do we fight our battles? How do we raise our kids? How do we eat certain ways? Not like the pagans. How do we have church? How do we treat aliens, orphans, widows? How do we have a fair economy? How do we balance justice? Guess what's in the Pentateuch? All of these things. They're all there. It's all what we'll look at as we continue this semester. So let's take a 5-minute break.